Okay, the shop is always a mess. It's a constant battle to make sure the things don't just pile up and get in my way. And I almost have to take as much time building as I do cleaning up because there's always things in the way. So we want to talk about this tail surface now and covering the tail surface. But first, a message from our sponsors. If you want to build a plane, you need to eat Chiquita bananas. This is how the work gets done. And San Pellegrino is the true beverage of airplane builders. Not really, but if you guys want to sponsor me, please let me know because I love San Pellegrino. And I'm going to drink this right now. So fresh. Ah! Okay, we're serious now. We're going to get this stuff out of here. But I do eat a lot of bananas. So, the tail surfaces are probably the hardest things to cover, hands down. In the manual, it says to start with the wing first, which is the most intimidating thing to do. And I would agree, it is intimidating, but it is the easiest thing to cover, hands down. I'm on the fuselage right now, so I can definitely confidently say that the wings are the easiest to cover. These are definitely the hardest. One of the reasons why they're so hard is because they have all these curves on the back. And as you know, maybe from other videos, it's very difficult to get this. It's not difficult, it's just a lot of work to get the fabric to work around a curve. It'll work if you're good with an iron, but there's definitely some technique involved, which I'm going to show eventually when I get to the fuselage. But it took me a while to understand it. This piece I actually covered. Let's see, did I start with this one with two pieces? Yeah, so this one, there's two ways you can do this. You can wrap one single piece of fabric all the way back, and that way you have basically the end of the fabric wrapping here, and then another fabric going on top of it. So it would be a single piece sort of clamshelling the whole end. That I tried to do on the rudder, and it ended up being a real pain. So what I decided to do instead was the other method, which is wrapping it in two pieces. This is how you wrap the wing. So it made sense to me to just do the tail surfaces this way. Let's stop looking at these patches, they're ugly. So this one is in two pieces, just like the other horizontal stabilizer, which is effectively the same thing. But what you end up doing is do the bottom first. So you basically cut a piece that wraps all the way around the front tube, like that. You wrap it around the rear. But I ended up learning that you need to leave this really long. So you have this end piece here. You want the fabric to be super long, so you have something to hold on to. You bunch it up and just take an iron and don't hit the tube, hit just the inside of the tube and sort of work out those wrinkles around the edges before you glue anything. And you just keep working out those wrinkles until it looks like it's going to lay flat on both these sides. Then cut it and then glue it down. But definitely a challenging process. And I wish I could explain a good way of doing it to you, but it's really just something you have to kind of experiment with. I'm going to show you how I do it with the vertical stabilizer, and that'll help get a good idea of how to cover it. But definitely the hardest part, definite learning curve. Some other thoughts about this. Does this one have inspection on the bottom? No, it doesn't. I got drain holes, which were on that wing over there. There's a couple ways of doing these. There's special grommets, not included in the kit, and I'm not buying them because I don't need them. But you need, for every bay, there's these every wooden rib basically delineates a bay. Every bay needs a drain hole. So you go through and take I just used a little washer and my burn tool. You put the washer on and just melt the middle of the washer out, and it makes you a drain hole. And Polyfiber says that you don't need a grommet on there as long as there are 2 layers of fabric. So because in fact, this is 3 layers of fabric. There are 2 finished tapes and then the bare fabric. That does not need reinforcement or anything. It's just fine just how it is. Seems kind of strange and a little bit odd, but it's the bottom of the wing. Who's going to see it? Doesn't even matter. So those are the drain holes. Finished tapes, they go on every wooden strip. You could use the 1-inch tapes, but I didn't have them at the time, and I didn't think it was necessary, so I just put 2-inch tapes on everything. It really doesn't make a big difference. One other dilemma that I ran into, again, I don't really know what I'm doing here, so I figure out these things along the way. When I was sanding this poly brush, the poly spray, the silver coat, I ended up sanding a hole all the way through the fabric. And that's because there was a tiny little, is that another one? No. There was a tiny little bump on the rib underneath. So I was like, what is this? I thought it was a pinhole, so I just kept trying to sand it out. And I realized I've sanded a hole all the way through the fabric. And And I went through this moral dilemma of trying to say, oh, it's fine, I just leave a hole in there. But I couldn't really live with myself unless I put a patch on. So I just put this finish tape patch on it. This brought me to a point where I was debating whether or not I should put anti-chafing tape on all these wooden ribs. And I don't know. I have a bunch of anti-chafing tape. Should I have put it on all the wooden ribs? That would have prevented them from rubbing any holes, probably. But the manual doesn't call for it. The polyfiber manual doesn't call for it. So I don't know why we get so much of it in the kit. So maybe it would be a good idea. Maybe that's a question to call polyfiber about, which I'm not going to do, but somebody out there might. So yeah, these are patches that I made. I just took all the poly spray off. It's really easy to do. You take MEK and you can wipe all this stuff off. So you took all the poly spray off, all the poly brush off, laid a patch down, coated this with a couple layers of poly brush, and then once I get the fuselage in ready for poly brush spray coat, then I'll spray 2 layers of poly brush on and then paint it and you won't even be able to see it. But that solves my hole in the tail surface problem. I usually say that I am my own cameraman. I said that in my last video, but I've hired a new one and he sucks.
Okay, ready? You're recording, right? So said that.
We are. Sorry, my cameraman sucks. I always say that I am my own cameraman, but I hired a new one. I didn't actually hire him. I just fed him a sandwich, and he sucks. So sorry if the camera work is like C or D class. It gets the job done. I want to talk about chasing wrinkles with the iron. So there's these big bag wrinkles when you start covering all these tiny little features that show up in the fabric. It's a big mystery as to whether or not they're going to show up when you put a paint coat on. And I spent a lot of, like I said earlier, my wrist hurts from ironing so much. I have iron wrist. I spent a lot of time trying to get all these tiny little imperfections out with the iron. But at the end of the day, a lot of them won't even show through. But let's just look at some of the ones that do show through, so it maybe helps inform what you have to work out with the iron. So this is the bottom. Obviously the bottom is not going to be perfect because it's the bottom of the elevator. Who the heck's going to see it? Nobody. So I don't really care. It's going to get beaten up by rocks and stuff anyway. But it's a good example of what shows through the fabric because I didn't put as much effort into getting the sort of imperfections out of the covering process. So over on the end here, I don't know if you can see this, but this was where the fabric was pulled over and had to be ironed down. And that was a little wrinkle that was at the corner of the seam. There's one right there, there's one right there, there's one right there. Those are just these tiny little wrinkles that show through on the paint and they show up as a tiny little bump. Mind you, I can still go through on top of even on this poly spray, I can go through and get those out with an iron, but I just, at a certain point, it's diminishing returns. If somebody's really that vain where they're going to comment about my wrinkles on the bottom of my elevator, then we're not going to be friends. So it's not really a big deal. So there's an example of something. This right here was where poly brush was tacked on a little bit too thick, and then I hit it with an iron. You can actually see the shape of my hobby iron right there. So that actually is showing through the paint. There's another example of it there. This was poly brush runs, these little imperfections here. There's poly tack runs somewhere on here. Like that was excess poly tack. This whole seam back here was a little bit of excess poly tack. I could have cleaned it off with MEK or ironed it out, but all of it eventually shows through. And it just makes more finish work for you later on. So if you're trying to chase out things with the iron, I guess a good rule of thumb is if you can feel it with your finger, it probably will show through. It is way easier to get it with the iron than it is to sand it later on. And at the end of the day, if it's on the bottom of the elevator, I don't care. So I'm not going to chase these out. So I put a lot of time into the top of my tail surfaces and then all of my wings, because actually the bottom of my wings are more important than the top of them. But I did put in a lot of effort into getting imperfections out of both the top and the bottom of the wing surfaces. But that's really the most time-consuming part about covering the tail surfaces. It is really hard to cover these tail surfaces. Just this one, I think alone, took me like 3 days. It's not like it's technically challenging. It's just tedious. I mean, you got to pull fabric and work wrinkles and spend many hours just chasing these tiny little wrinkles that seem like they're never going to go away, but eventually they do. So, yeah. I think that's it for the tail surfaces. Finish tapes are pretty straightforward. I did mention that the bias tapes are not included, so you got to go buy those, which I see why they're not included because they're pretty expensive. This is, I think, a 4-inch bias tape that when I put it on, what I did is I tacked it to the outside here, and then you pull it tight all the way around and cinch it up all the way where you want it so that it's laying as flat as you possibly can. You measure it and cut it how long you want, and then you just slowly tack it down as you go, getting it to lie down straight, and it ends up turning out pretty well. This is a nice look. It's got a little bit of variation to it on either side, but I still think it's a nice curve and pretty straight line on the tail. But those bias tapes, I have no idea how the heck you would do this without a bias tape, but they're not included in the kit, so you got to go buy them yourself, which is kind of a bummer. And then the rest of the finished tapes they go on like finished tapes, which is, you make sure you gob a bunch of polybrush on there first, because they stick a lot better and it's a lot less work later on. You just gob a whole bunch of polybrush on there as a pre-coat, and then put a big fat layer of polybrush, lay the tape down, then put a big fat layer of polybrush on top of it, and shouldn't have any problems. So yeah, cool. Okay, we're going to talk about the butt rib dilemma. So, as you may know, this is a butt rib. It's not called a butt rib, and it has anything to do with butts, but it does butt up against the wing, so that's why they call it the butt rib. I just think it's the silliest piece on the plane, and we always joke about it. Nonetheless, I did this wrong. We're going to go over the fuselage so we can see what this looks like. This is how the butt rib attaches to the fuselage. So there's basically 4 of these little metal pieces that slide onto this slot and lock this thing in place. And this one's a real pain. I'm not even going to put it back. Yeah, oh wow, that worked well. So what that does is it allows basically a continuous surface for the wing to connect to here. So the wing will basically butt up against this butt rib, and it'll look like a continuous surface to here. And then the windshield will start going from there. The manual, we'll show a picture of what the manual looks like. Manual has very, very, very bad instructions on this one. What it does tell you that you have to do is take this little aluminum strip, which is a tiny little piece of floppy aluminum, and glue it up against the top of the cap strip here. I was just stupid, and I should have just inferred that the way I did it was wrong. There's a long side and a short side. You see, one side here is longer than the other. See, this one like barely even protrudes, and this one sticks out pretty far. This piece is cut just long enough so that it almost perfectly lines up with this long side. And I should have just seen, oh, wow, that matches perfectly. That's maybe where it should go. Nope, wrong. I just put it on the wrong side and glued it in place. So what I've done basically is ripped that other piece of aluminum out, and now I have a bunch of high sol in here that I'm going to have to go sand out with a sander, and I'm going to have to glue it to the other side. What this does is adds a reinforcement for attaching the windshield. So let's just look at the one that's on the fuselage. If this was done properly, this piece, I'll put this other butt rib down. This piece would be glued in there, and when the windshield sits on top here, the windshield actually is call it a moon roof. The top of the windshield, or the moon roof part, sits up atop this butt rib, and it actually mounts through this cap strip here. And this aluminum piece is a reinforcement plate for the back of the cap strip. You see what I did wrong is I put it on the short end, and there's no way I'm going to mount the windshield to this tiny little strip. And now I'm going to have to undo both of these. I'm not going to redo my butt ribs entirely because there's no need to. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of sanding and stuff. But I am going to rip this piece out, replace it with a thin one on the other side. Well, the same piece, but on the other side. And we'll call it a day. And I'll have to end up cleaning all that high sol out. It'll actually be a lot of work, but it'll be a lot less work than trying to redo the whole thing. So one of the things that Project Kitfox talks about is how, again, the manual doesn't really say which side to go in and out. I actually can't remember if it does, but I remember this being a problem piece. It was very hard to understand. But you see that the long side and the short side basically have a direction where they're supposed to go. We inferred, when I was doing this a while ago, that the long side was supposed to go on the outside, which is actually technically the correct way to do it. But it would be easier if you switch these and effectively the long side was on the inside. So if I had switched these around from the beginning, the long side's on the inside, and that gives you, I haven't gotten there yet, but watch Brian's video. He talks about how that helps you screw the windshield in later on without having to be really close to the edge of the windshield. So I did that, not wrong, but I wish I did that differently. But these are already mounted. I'm not going to redo it. I'm just going to redo this thing and call it good. So there's the butt ribs. Here's the instructions for the butt rib mounting. So it's kind of vague. It does show that there's a differential length. It shows the long side on the outside and the short side on the inside. It would give you somewhat of an advantage to flip that around and have the long side on the inside and the short side on the outside. But the instructions do show the long side on the outside. And they say part H under cap strip, and it just points to the middle. To me, that looks like it's pointing to the short side. Part H is the AL backing strip. And it says, trim the aluminum backing strips to fit underneath each upper butt rib cap strip. And it says just position it as close to the butt rib web as possible. And it just tells you what it's for. But it doesn't tell you which side to put it on. And I should have just inferred that it goes on the outside, but there's no image of it there. There's no way of really knowing what it's supposed to look like. So it's just a sort of a vague part of the manual. And you would assume, maybe, if we go to final installation, so it doesn't really show the aluminum strip in there. So there's no way of knowing, is it supposed to be on the inside or on the outside? It shows this image there, which is for the back side of it. It does show this here with the weather stripping. But again, the image is pretty bad. So it's kind of hard to say whether or not those screw holes are on the inside or the outside. These are some wing rotisseries not wing rotisseries, these are fuselage rotisseries, but it actually was just a wing stand that I ended up repurposing, and I can use for both. We built these whole, basically out of scrap, we built these whole things out of scrap. All it is it's 1 inch, I got my safety sandals on, you like these? Steel toe safety sandals. I've got 1 inch by 2 inch square tubing. This is a 2 inch square tubing. This is a 1.5 inch square tubing. I didn't have a lot of 1.5 inch, so I ended up taking scrap of both of these and welding them together so that they make a nice attachment point. But let's see, there's a little, basically an axle piece that goes in this tiny little piece of steel tubing. And I thought I could lock this in place with this tiny screw. There's way too much leverage on this thing. There's no way to hold it in place. So my workaround is to take the wing racks and use that as a stop on the angle iron that I put there, and that helps me rotate and lock this whole thing in place. So we're going to tip this thing over. Let's just go back there. So the front of this is, let's take that off. The front of this is pretty straightforward. I used all the existing engine mounts with wing nuts on the back and just welded pieces of angle iron to hold the front end of it. And that goes to this little axle point. If I had to do this again, I would have used the bigger, I guess this is 2 inch tubing to go inside one of these tubes. And that would have allowed me to lock it in place with one of these nuts, because it would give me more leverage instead of just this dinky piece here. But it works. I have no complaint. The back end, which we can go look at, I stole this directly from the Kitfox factory. It's just a tractor U-joint that I got from, not Tractor Supply, from Rural King, that allows you to effectively turn, and it no longer needs to maintain the angle. If you were to put the straight pipe through there, then it would have to basically put torque on your pipe every time, but this way it allows you to really get weird about the angles. And then this is just a 3/4 inch steel tubing that have screws all the way through it and mount to the existing rudder mount points to hold and support it. The factory only uses these two mount points here. I have a picture of one of their racks. And that would probably be enough, but I just, might as well over-engineer it. I just threw another one on there. So these are great. I put casters on there so we can roll it around. And when I want to do wings in this rotisserie, I can just pop these little metal pieces off and throw the wing racks on, and this becomes a multi-purpose tool. I didn't want to make them look super pretty because when I'm done, I don't really need them for anything anymore. So I guess they're just scrap garbage. So they're not super awesome, but they work. What were we gonna talk about after that? Turtle deck. Okay, the mystery's been solved. This is the correct piece. I was sent the incorrect piece. This is the right one. It's a piece of aluminum. It's thicker than the other piece they sent me, and it's got one long side and one short side. What this does is it goes over all these cam lock mount tabs, and it allows a flat surface for the turtle deck to basically seal and close off on. What you have to do before covering is basically to carve these ends out so that it fits over the end of tubing here, and then pre-drill, match drill all these cam lock holes in the aluminum before you cover, just like that. And what I've been told, it's also in the manual, and I heard this from the factory, what you do is you cut this before you cover, and then once I get the bare covering on, I'm gonna mount this on there with rivets and everything. I guess it's like a nut plate, but it is rivets. So I mount this on there with the rivets, and then use body filler, which yes, you can use superfill over the fabric. So I use body filler on these edges and get a nice smooth edge, so you won't even be able to see it. And then you put a finish tape on top of that, and it'll make it look really nice. But that was a big mystery. It has been solved and finished. And that was it for having the fuselage ready to cover. That was it. And as you can see, the fuselage is 2/3 covered. All right, so I want to talk about my paint booth, which to me looks like a Chinese meth lab. And this is where I film my OnlyFans. Okay, on a real note, it's made out of bamboo. Why did I use bamboo? Well, tell me where you're gonna find a 30-foot piece of material that's free, that's also flexible and lightweight. Bamboo, to me, is the best option for that. They use it to make scaffolding in Asia, so it's a really, really strong, really flexible, super lightweight material. We've got a ton of it here in Florida. So what I did was I cut these long pieces of bamboo, I strapped them to the top of my truck, which was kind of goofy in itself, and tied them to the roof of this steel building with rope, basically suspended them as an attachment point, and draped clear plastic, just poly sheet on the edge to close it off. And I first started trying to tape the ends, but it ended up it didn't work out super well because the tape's really hard to get on. So my new strategy is just staple it. So you get a stapler, you sort of roll this stuff up, and then with just like an office stapler, you go and staple it shut. And that seals off all your ends. The way I attached it to the top was with zip ties and staples. You can see the black zip ties up there. That was originally how I started doing it. If you're saying I'm being wasteful with zip ties, I have like 4,000 zip ties. So I can do this another probably 100 times before I'm gonna run out of zip ties. So I used all those zip ties, and then the rest of them I just used a staple gun to get the top fabric in place. There is a middle support piece that goes down the middle that I also use to hang, like the tail surfaces to paint. And that also keeps the plastic on the top from drooping, but it's pretty good. Hello?
Oh, look at that.
Okay, so this is just, I have my pony clamps that I use to seal it off. I just clip the pony clamps onto the plastic. I'll do one on each side. Only open it up. It's not perfectly airtight, and quite frankly, it doesn't have to be. It does keep down dust on the inside, but the big thing that you're about to see is that it keeps the dust in there when you're painting, or the overspray. So this has got a nifty little pulley system. All right, there's that. So in here are my old wing stands. This is just a cheapo box fan that is just literally stapled to the plastic. I cut a hole and stapled it. And you see it's really nasty. Oh, that's all dry paint products that it's overspray that ends up getting caught to the fan on its way out. So that's enough actually to ventilate this whole facility. I'm not trying to get fresh air because I use my organic respirators, but it does keep the dust down. I probably didn't even need to do this, but I just stapled a AC filter to the back, and this is my intake. Although this thing leaks like a sieve, so who knows? We're probably getting air from every corner of this thing, but you know, at least it is an attempt. This, when the fan turns on, this does want to suck in. So I ended up just zip tying the sides over. And then I had to weight the bottom down because again, it's like, it wants to suck the whole thing together. So I put wood and metal to keep it from sort of closing in on me, as well as a piece of rope there. Then here, we've got my place to hang the tail surfaces when I'm painting them. I basically hang them on 2 points, which is kind of hard to work with, but it ends up working out fine. And yeah, this is the paint booth. The big thing about the paint booth is, like, you see how dusty this is? There's all this crap. That's overspray. It's not just dirty in here. So when you're painting the silver on, it gets all dusty. And so all that dust settles out to the floor. And if I didn't have the paint booth, it would get all over the shop, and this whole shop would be dusty. But instead, it's now all contained to this space. And it's enough to contain it just for long enough for it to blow out. I ended up buying the sort of the Apollo paint sprayer, which is an HVLP system. Works awesome. It's a great system. It's just this little blue, not blue, what color is that? This little green box over here. Super easy to use. No need for a massive compressor. Definitely gets the job done. So yeah, the air goes and gets blown out of here. And then I have this fan to help blow the fumes out the garage door when I'm actually painting. The fumes aren't what I'm worried about primarily. It's not the fumes, it's the overspray that's most of the problem. Because the fumes are okay if you just put a mask on. This isn't the really intense stuff like, I guess it's like Ranthane or whatever the fancy urethane paints are. This stuff is, a respirator is fine. And it honestly off-gases pretty quickly. So as long as there's enough to just blow it out the door, there's plenty of fresh air in here, and the overspray stays inside the paint booth. I'm gonna have to do another video on painting. It's really not that hard. I was intimidated by it, but I'm in the process right now. When I get to a point where I'll have time to film it, I'll get a brief clip of how I'm painting the actual surface. It's pretty straightforward. It's like spray paint with a paint gun. Yeah, that's it. I'm caught up. It's everything I've done. With the exclusion of covering the fuselage, which we're going to next. And sorry about being behind on everything, but from this point on, I'll try and stay up to date on the videos and keep everybody in the loop with my slow progress here. So yeah, peace.